When I paint a picture or make a picture, it's typically because I think I've got either a half interesting idea or something that I'd like to say and remember. And so I do it through painting. So I was born here in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, about a block actually that way. Lived here most of my life. I went away to school a couple of times. I lived for a year in Louisiana. And outside of that, I've stayed in Yarmouth. Chose to come back to the same neighborhood. The first art lessons I took were through a gal called Elaine McEachran, Art in Action. I believe that was in grade 6 or 7. And I was there for 1 or 2 years. And there was about 6 to 8 or 10 even students in the first room when you'd walk in. And then through a second room, it was tight, but there was another maybe 6 or even 8. But at the time, I knew about through a very close friend, Laura Hatfield, about Trudy and Paula Garson, who also were doing art lessons at the time. And that was across from Rudders, where Sea Hags and Scallywags currently is. They had 2 classes. One was considered children's or a youth class, and the other was sort of like the big kids' room. They were always very encouraging in terms of being, just creative. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all, except for every year, the first lesson of the year was a still life. And they'd have a still life set up in the classroom. You painted the still life, or you drew it, or whatever. The rest of the year, you did what you wanted. I made an image once called Pencil Leg Pete, and I glued pencils as legs for this guy with googly eyes to a canvas playing a big banjo-y guitar. Actually, it was supposed to be a Gibson SG guitar. And he had Google eyes, and it was called Pencil Leg Pete. And they thought it was funny. They encouraged it, Yeah, so my swim coach, Ginny Smith, when I was young, maybe I was 11, 12, or 13 at the time, she recognized that I was enjoying painting, and she said, I have a friend I'd like for you to meet, Thea Witten, who lived where now is Studio Gallery Cafe. And I went in and saw her artwork, and it struck me because it was a lot different than the work that I had seen a lot around town, which was not necessarily tourist driven, but of course people paint what they see and what they like, and maybe what sells and things like that. And so when you're used to seeing a lot of realism, landscapes and seascapes and fishing boats and lighthouses and things like this, which is ironic because I do a lot of it now. But Thea had paintings that were a lot different, bright and bold and dark and dreamy and just very expressive. So it really opened my mind in terms of creating work that you weren't worried what the viewer maybe thought about it, that it didn't have to be a certain subject matter or of a certain nature. So that was really great. I would have loved to have owned one of her pieces. I've never seen one for sale or anything, she passed away several years ago. But one day that would be one of those things if I can find one. Maybe the first public artwork I ever did was the cabinet on the pool deck of the YMCA. If you remember that had those weird creepy fish and seaweed on it. I painted that when I was 10 or 11 years old. Yeah, and actually very recently I was contacted by a friend who saved it. So that cabinet exists now. It has a second life in Cayman. The interesting thing for me when I was young was seeing kids in class who would draw and make pictures in their books and in their notes, I would think how much of a better artist those kids were. Right. But they weren't even taking art, or doing art or showing art. And I always found that interesting to see the hidden artists, I kind of think everybody's an artist in some ways. I think art kind of is contributing something interesting that people think twice about. I think that's an artful thing. Whether it's a picture or a cup of coffee or a record or landscaping or, good work, interesting work. I don't think that making visual things that can be consumed, qualifies you as an artist. I think that everybody's got the ability When I left Yarmouth, I went to university in Sackville, New Brunswick. I did sign up for some programs in the fine arts department. They probably weren't for me, I don't think. So they didn't really last very long for various reasons. Mostly I was trying to understand, art history and technique and things like this, and it was just too sort of academic for what I was interested in, studying other artists and studying how they did things. And I don't want to sound ignorant about it, but I always found I was influenced and impacted artistically by what was happening around me, kind of at a given time or moment. And so to have an understanding of art history is important. I realize this now, but I think I was kind of at the time seeking maybe more direction in improving, shall we say, hands-on practical stuff, which you couldn't actually participate in those classes, I don't think, unless you were signed up for a BFA and maybe intro to drawing or something. Maybe that sounds bad, that I didn't respect it at the time, but I just found it boring. So I dropped out of art history after a semester, and I tried it again later in college, but again, I wasn't into it.
Weren't ready for it then?
No, but the lucky thing for me was being at Mount Allison was there were professors who were practicing artists at the time in the fine arts department. When I was in Mount Allison, I had a radio show on Fridays, and through the radio station there I met some pretty interesting folks and artists. And so the community there on its own, I think, was influential in the sense that people were kind of able to, be as weird as they wanted to be, and they didn't have to worry about it so much. Well, I would say in terms of my style, it is unrefined, unprofessional, and sort of all over the place. Yeah, so I would say, the artistic style that I've got, basically comes from the choice of colors and the movement within the work. And I'm typically choosing similar colors for a series of pieces or over a period of time. This year I did make the decision to do pieces of a much smaller scale than I had been working on for a long period of time. Which for me didn't really work the best. Yeah, I don't know if I could define a style that I have. And again, I would have to go back to the Garson Sisters and probably the palette knife. I remember the first time I used a palette knife actually now. I was in grade 7 because I remember writing my grade on the back of it, and I put it in a painting competition. And it was of a tree, and it was with only 3 colors. And so I painted the canvas with a background and a foreground, as though I was going to then paint a scene onto it, but instead I used the knife and scratched the tree out and revealed the color behind it. I guess from there the palette knife stuff really took off with me. I did a lot of work with palette knife, 2 or 3 years for sure, and the more I'm thinking about it now, it might even have been a lot longer than that, with just using a palette knife and a small amount of brush. Even to sign, I would try to use the knife to scratch into the painting. Yeah, it's just, there's a lot into them, whether they seem simple or basic. The one over there, it's a bunch of yellow and blue, and what is it? Well, it's a canola field. Well, who gives a crap? It's a canola field. Well, I was in Cape Town, and a friend of mine's husband who's from there, super generous guy. So I was off on the weekend. Would you like to come with us to Stellenbosch? We drove 60, 70 minutes from Cape Town through countrysides and hills and all this stuff, and just the scenery and things. I'd never seen anything like it. I mean, it was just really stunning. And so we passed all these yellow fields, these canola fields. So, I mean, as basic as the painting is, and it's only 2 colors, and they're watered down or they're heavy. It was just, I had never seen anything kind of like that. There's nothing wrong with painting exact scenes, of course. This looks exactly like this space or this thing or this person, and that's the intention of the artist. There's artist hyper-realists where really until you are this far from it, you can't even see a brushstroke. It looks like a photograph. Some people are enamored by it and shocked, like, oh my God, this is incredible. Other people think, well, but why? It's boring. But is it? Is it boring? It's kind of exciting that someone can create a painting that looks like a photograph. And same with photography. I mean, 100 people could take a photo of the same thing. Everybody's kind of angle on it or perspective on it is slightly different. Yeah, I think it's important. It's always important to not forget that your perspective matters. Ten-ish or so years ago, I started doing Meals on Wheels the odd time when I was home. Alex Jigaroff was on the list on Fridays, if I remember correctly, only Fridays. And so I would go see Alex first because he was the nearest to the hospital, but then I learned very quickly, Alex likes to chat. So it's not really a quick in and out type of thing. And so I would always feel rushed and we got to the point of talking, he said, oh no, I don't care if the food comes late or cold or whatever, I just like to have the company. So I started delivering Alex's stuff last, and I'd spend hours with him, and we would chit chat, and then I started to visit him regularly. The last 2 or 3 years he was alive. Over several visits I'd ask him, what inspired you to first paint? And he said, when I was a young child and I'd go with my mother who knitted and sewed, we would go to the thread store together and she'd let me pick out colors that I liked. And I would ask him about the mural that he did with Hugh and his relationship with other artists. And he would talk about Lucy Jarvis and Helen Weld and share just great stories. And so he was another one of those artists where he was creative and it didn't matter, and he painted what he wanted to paint and stuff that he loved, And of course he had his commissions and stuff that people wanted to hire him to paint, but he had a lot of work that was really, really creative, beautiful stuff. In a similar vein, I can remember when I was younger and Little Lebanon was open, my wife and I, we were dating then, we would go to Little Lebanon. We'd go to Little Lebanon and Peter had Brian Porter work always in there. And, one was a pirate on a motorcycle, I think, and it said, "Ye be ready." And there was a large, maybe 3 by 3 foot painting of a beautiful butterfly and all this different stuff. So again, it was this work that was just much different and very creative and impactful and stuff that you think about after you've seen it. And so I thought, well, geez, I'd like to meet Brian Porter. This was maybe in 2002 or 2003. And I remember I went to meet him for the first time. Maria and I went. He had just made a series of artwork that he was going to show at Secord that year. He showed us the work, and we hung out for a long time. And since, Brian and I have become great, great friends. He's like family. I was quite luckily asked by a gallery in Halifax to show my work with Brian, which to me was quite a honor, to say the least. And so I had a lot of time to prepare for that show. I ordered canvases specifically knowing the space of the room where the paintings were going to be shown, but also knowing I was sharing the space with Brian. I mean, I'd love to do a show of 10, 15, 20, 8 by 8 foot canvases, but where do I even put them all? I can't even fit one into this room. I showed the gallery, I think I showed them 15 or 16 pieces. I think they took 10 or 12. I made 22 or 25 pieces. A bunch of them are turned backwards behind me and will be covered over. Just ideas that I had that required a bigger space, just because of the nature of what they were. Probably 95% of the time I go down into my art studio and I have an idea in mind, and probably 100% of the time I never end up doing that, ever. And I have a Microsoft Word document, a living document that I have saved online, that when I come up with an idea for a painting, painting about this color, this shape, remember this, and then I make notes and reference. I don't think I've ever done one of them. And so the list grows and grows and grows, and I think there's 140 or 50 sort of ideas with explanations on how to execute them. And dozens of sketchbooks, that I've taken offshore, books that have literally traveled around the world and written down ideas and shapes, and then, black and white drawing, and I'll write colors in and spaces. But again, it's just when you get in the moment that you want to create something and paint something, it just kind of takes over, My job affects my artwork I would say a lot, especially in the last 10 years, because certainly in the last 10 years I've had a lot of longer trips at sea. So my career keeps me away from home a lot. Half the year or more some years. There was a period of 1 year where I was only home for 4 weeks. If you bookend that with the year before and after, it was actually more like I was only home for a month and a year and a half kind of thing, which was challenging. And now, when I get home from work, a great transition, a healthy transition is to make artwork. And also before I leave. But my work does take me away a lot of places, but always in the marine environment. It used to have a lot to do with gas and oil, but I got out of that industry about 10 years ago. So I switched to fiber optic cables and power cables, wind farms, that sort of thing. It's extremely interesting. And so you're always around the ocean, and when you're 600 or 700 miles off the coast of somewhere, and there's no other vessels in sight and things like that, for periods of days or weeks or even a month or longer. The changing color of the ocean, the main color of the ocean can change a few times in a day. In the period of a month, you could see 100 shades of blue or more. But with the wind and with the clouds and with the sun and with the night sky and giant pods of whales and flying fish especially are pretty fascinating. Sharks. Yeah, I don't know. And I guess the other thing too with my work influencing my artwork, and not to kind of ramble on too much, is sometimes I'm in cities, real busy cities for periods and staying like in kind of like, not necessarily typical tourist parts of the city, but busier parts where there's a lot of different types of action going on. And that has an effect on my artwork as well, I think. And sometimes strange hours. I remember once we were in a certain country and we had to be choosy about the times of day we were working. We were on land. And so I was up a lot late at night and through the middle hours. And I'd always find it interesting to kind of look out the window of a huge building in some foreign city. And then, there's distant buildings and only a few lights on in some of them. You'd always sort of wonder, maybe someone's left the light on, or maybe they're also away working. But I think there's a lot of arts in Yarmouth. I think there's a lot that you don't see, and I think there's some that you do see. I think that Yarmouth could be a real true arts destination. Music arts, visual arts, all the arts. I think sometimes people are busy and they don't necessarily have time to support all, events and venues and things that are going on. But I mean, I've seen art openings in Yarmouth that have had hundreds of people, and I've seen art openings in Yarmouth that have had a handful of people. The local theater just sold, they sold out 10 shows. Certain bands will bring large audiences. We have the venues for it. But I think there's a lot of talent in Yarmouth. There's, the space in the mall, the Yarmouth Creative Space. There's a couple of dozen artists there. There's the Waterfront Gallery. There's the Yark, of course. There's the Seahag Scallywags place. There's the Spots in Port Maitland. Spots just up in Clare. The one special thing that many people don't consider about Yarmouth in terms of being a hub for creativity is that we're not surrounded by influence the way that most places are. So instead of, being surrounded by, multiple towns or other cities, we're surrounded mostly by water. And so we're kind of, both isolated and left alone and cut off, yet connected. And I think you can be uniquely as connected or as left alone as you want to be around here. Artistically, there are people to connect with. In terms of opportunities to show your work in Yarmouth, they're there. Maybe you get a bit older and different experiences in life, they affect you, in your everyday routine. I don't really have an everyday routine just because of the nature of my work, and when I'm home, there's certain things, of course, you need to accomplish, but it's just thinking about different things in your life that have impacted you and how they translate, whether it's intentional or not, whether you realize it at the time. It's just how it all translates in the end. And Brian would say, well, what's it all mean? What's it all mean? Who knows? Because sometimes, you make a million paintings and maybe sell them or maybe not sell them, and then they end up piling up on a wall or a closet or wherever. And sometimes you think about, well, what's really the point in doing all of this? But at the end of the day, I think that creating things, it's valuable, and it's one of the greatest liberties in life to be able to make something. Whether it's a craft or art or write something or play music or sing a song, it's important.